Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up for discussion on our Viewpoints panel. Youth behavior is getting worse, according to a major study. Later on, we'll be looking at tips to overcoming the winter blues. Stay tuned. And these are the issues we'll be presenting today to our Viewpoints panelists for commentary. The Vanier Institute of the Family has released a study showing a dramatic increase in behavioral problems among youth. Why is the big question? Considerable controversy surrounding Stephane Dion's leadership, and it has been reflected in the latest polls. Well, according to one Globe and Mail columnist, Canadians are warming up to private health care delivery. But are we really? Later on, we'll be looking at tips to overcoming the winter blues. But first, let's meet our Viewpoints guests. Paul McKeever is leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, and Michael Shapcott is senior fellow with the Wellesley Institute. He's also a poverty advocate. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now, the first study that we're looking at here today, now this is coming out from the Vanier Institute of the Family, and it's showing something pretty alarming here, that 1 in 5 kids are showing severe behavior problems. This is not just mild here. This is something relating to intentionally harming others. Now, some reasons are cited in this particular survey here. It's offered up by Anne-Marie Ambert, who was the lead author of this particular study. She says that parents are working longer hours for one. Schools and neighborhoods, there's no longer that community spirit or community sort of a way that we once saw. There's also less emphasis, she says, on religion in the home and in society as a whole. And we have a lot of single-parent homes. Now, these are the reasons given, but once again, society is always battling back and forth, trying to figure out why is it that we're seeing such dramatic, well, I don't want to say, well, increases in bizarre behavior among our youth. And I'm going to start with you, Michael, on this one. What do you say?
Well, I think this is a perennial discussion. I think all parents wonder about what's happening with kids and that younger generation. I grew up in the 1960s, and certainly the adults of those times were wondering why it was that kids wanted to have long hair and listen to incomprehensible music and do various things, which of course I didn't do because I was a good little kid.
Never, not you.
But apparently everybody else was doing it around me. All my friends were. So I think to a certain extent I wonder about if you take a long-term perspective. The other day I was looking at a study from Toronto in 1918 that was worried about the number of young people that were coming in front of courts because of petty crimes and so on, and saying that there was a real problem with our youth back in 1918. So I think it's a problem, but the one thing I liked about this study actually was that what it does do is it says that what kids do has to be seen as part of the broader social context, that you can't just say it's bad kids, that you have to look at what are the social influences that are leading kids to these kinds of concerns. And I think that's very important to ask what's happening in our society. Are we giving kids the nourishment that they need, both the physical nourishment but also the social nourishment?
Do you say that we are?
I don't think we are. I think there's some bad things happening in our society. For instance, the area I work in terms of poverty, we have a huge amount of poverty. 1 in 5 kids in Canada are below the low-income cutoff, which is the poverty line, which means they're not getting proper food, they're probably not living in good housing, they're probably not thriving in schools because of this. So I think those social influences do have a profound effect on kids. And I'm not saying all poor kids are bad kids, because they aren't.
That's for sure.
But I am saying that those social influences do have an effect on the way kids lead their lives.
Mm-hmm. Paul?
Well, I take a different view. The tone of the report seemed to be that if people just spent more time together, if we were nicer to one another, well, then that would solve the problem of children growing up being unnice to other people. But as I see it, the cure is almost as bad as the disease. Mm-hmm. The problem, as I see it, is that we tell kids essentially nowadays that there is no right, there is no wrong, that we have to tolerate all forms of activity, not to judge. And as a result, we end up with things like slogans. it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. Well, that says that there's no value in winning or succeeding, that just playing honestly is all you have to do in life. Well, the problem with that is that children grow up playing honestly and then not getting rewarded. They think that if they're just nice with other people, that somehow they'll do well in life, and they won't. They have to learn to value success. They have to learn to take personal responsibility to succeed and to stop making their relationships with others their means for success. Social climbing is not the means to success, and when you think it is, you shave your head, put a tattoo on it, and say, look at me, in the hopes that people will think you're new and interesting and unique, and that somehow you'll get some kind of benefit by being socially interesting. People need to be willing to teach children that there is right and wrong, and that justice consists in paying for what you get and getting only what you pay for. And children have to learn that if they do work hard, they can succeed, and that it's possible in this world. They see all the failures around them because they see people trying to succeed by making people their friends instead of just getting down to the hard work of producing something that people like. And that makes people social right from the get-go.
You made some very good points, but you know, Michael also said something that was key too, that throughout the course of time we tend to generationally have a gap and say, well, look, what's happening to the world? Why are the kids behaving the way they are? Youth is always a time of experimentation. The transition from childhood into adulthood has never been easy. We do tend to live in quite a complex system. If you look at North American society, even if you look historically up to the past maybe 5 decades, we can still see how we vary from other places in the world where we perhaps are more individualistic, less community support from that point of view. But one thing though, when you look at our generation today, in fact the kids, what they're growing up in today, there seems to be more of a one generation gap. It's almost as if with the rise in technology that we've seen, the speed at which we've moved, the world has moved, globalization and so forth, what has happened to the family unit, that we've almost skipped a generation, so that parents, they're no longer parenting their children, but it's almost as if they're parenting their grandchildren. And to me, this has left somewhat of a void in between, where there seems to be such a gap that the kids seem to have little direction, even with the family breakdown of today. Michael, what do you think of this?
Well, I share a lot of your views. I mean, I think it's very important to have a collective memory as a society. You know, I was saying before we went on the air that I woke up at 6 this morning in order to work with my daughter, who was studying for a philosophy exam on Plato and Aristotle this morning, and over the last number of days, as she's been studying for the exam and I've been trying to help her out, I think that there's actually some really rich things from our collective human history that we need to bring forward. But we live in a society where yesterday doesn't exist and the day before never happened.
That's a major problem.
And I think that it is important to be critical and to examine things. And I guess I would say to Paul that listening to you, I think that the way you play the game, there are right and wrong ways to play the game, and it does matter how you play the game. And I look at in the last 10 or 15 years in the business world that some of the practices of some of the corporations that we've seen, the Enrons and so on, where the whole goal of it has been to accumulate money at no matter what the cost, and I think that's wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a false dichotomy between succeeding and playing the game. It isn't one or the other. It's how you win the game should be the answer. It's not how you play the game, it's how you win it. And it's not just whether you win, it's whether you win by acting in a moral way on your route to getting there.
So true.
You can't separate success from the means by which you succeed, and when you do so, you end up with what we're seeing today.
Interesting how Michael mentioned philosophy, though, because even when you look at the philosophical grounds of moral philosophy, we seem to have lost that sort of a dimension in society.
Well, and nowadays we judge people's value by the size of their iPod, for instance.
Which is pitiful, really.
Yeah, and
we tend to be an instant gratification, materialistic society at the risk of sounding really old, but...
and I have to say, I love gadgets as much as everybody else, and I think that these things are fun, but I think to take that step, which is what's happened, and I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, like my parents sounded 20 or 40 years ago, but when you take that step of saying that these things do matter more than just simply having a device that can allow you to listen to music when you're walking down the street. When we begin to confer higher values on those things, and inevitably we lose other values, and how we relate to each other and the importance of our human relationships become very, very important. Things get devalued to the point where the main value we put on things is the dollar value.
Interestingly, I was listening to moral philosophy on my iPod as I approached the studio.
Well, there you go.
So I wouldn't say that we have to in any way undervalue the great things that the human mind has brought us, technology that allows us to learn about philosophy and to know about the moral values as well as the material values. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. I think it's right to try and obtain the material values that your happiness and survival depend on, but that you cannot ever achieve those values if you don't also have a firm grasp of how you should approach those problems of obtaining
It's
them.
about balance. We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking about Stephane Dion's leadership. Lots of controversy there. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Well, there's considerable controversy surrounding Stephane Dion's leadership. Now, I have an article here with me. There you go. There's the headline. He has, quote, Stockwell Day syndrome. Now, this article that we're looking at here, it's very derogatory, and I'm going to actually read the first couple of lines verbatim. Here's what the National Post columnist Don Martin says. Not since Canadian Alliance leader Stockwell Day roared off on a jet ski with a geyser of water shooting up his well-suited behind has a new party leader suffered a shorter honeymoon than Stephane Dion. Their initials must be cursed, unquote. Quite the unflattering start to a commentary about Stephane Dion. Needless to say, at least in my opinion, I have to agree on one front that it's been a really rocky start for Stephane Dion. I mean, right from almost day one, where it was declared that he had dual citizenship. Controversy began there, and it just seems like one after the other ever since. I'm going to start with you this time on this one. Do you agree with this columnist? Do you think he's a bit harsh of Stephane Dion?
Boy, here I am. I'm going to be judged for judging because I'm a party leader too.
Well, you're being asked to.
Well, that's all right. But I'm in favor of judging. So I'll just say, you know, I never thought that he was the best choice for the Liberal Party. I'm not sure that they had a best choice out of the crop that they had there.
It was a tough one.
It was a tough one. And I think all kinds of weird politics went into, including the way they chose, the system they used to choose the leader, I think interfered. I don't think they ended up with the leader they even wanted ultimately. But that said, I think the Liberals should take some consolation in this, and that is that it's almost never the case that people vote personalities or parties into power. What happens in reality is that you have to, as the government, get the public so upset with you or annoy them enough that they want you out of power, in which case they'll then turn to the next best and they'll say, look, what's the biggest hammer to knock these guys out of power? And if it happens to be the Liberal Party, it won't matter if King Kong's leading it. It will be the case that they'll vote Liberal. Now, I think the problem they have right now is that there isn't that lack of contentment with the progressive or with the Conservatives federally. I think they're doing a job that's satisfying most Canadians, and so I think the real uphill battle for the Liberals is that they don't have anywhere to grab on, even if they had someone more perhaps. With more panache, I still don't think they'd be able to get in. They wouldn't be able to get in with Pierre Trudeau at this point, in my view, if Pierre Trudeau had not already been known to people.
Your position, Michael?
Well, politics, especially today, is a blood sport. And I do have to say that I feel sorry for any party leader. I feel sorry for Stephane Dion. Everything about the man, from his backpack to, it's just been dissected, and in our 24-hour news environment, there's nothing that can be hidden, and so it's a tough and unrelenting atmosphere. That having been said, I prefer to look at the politicians, party leaders, politics based on what they're doing, as opposed to, what kind of backpack they're wearing, or if their smile is crooked, or if their hairstyle is not up to the current standards. And on that, I don't really see the Liberals providing an effective opposition. In our parliamentary system, you have the government, you have the opposition. We, of course, have several parties in opposition, but the chief opposition party is the Liberals. And you look to them to present an alternative vision. Clearly the polls are showing that actually no one's catching anybody on fire. The Conservatives haven't roared away and moved into the territory which would allow them to capture a majority. The Liberals are certainly nowhere near that. The other parties, the Green, the NDP, the Bloc, they're all sort of in their various positions. So I don't think anyone has really connected with Canadians in terms of that majority territory. And so maybe we're in an era in politics, sort of like the 1960s, where we had back-to-back minority governments. Now, the 1960s, from my perspective, was actually a pretty good time for Canadian politics. We brought in a number of programs that I think were really good, and many Canadians think were good. Our national health care programs, some of our improved welfare legislation, the kinds of things that help to define a generation of Canadian government. So maybe politics, we're going to get into that era, but at this point, I don't see Stephane Dion delivering.
I hear what the two of you are saying about the Liberal Party. I mean, they had it going at one point in history. I mean, boy, did they have it. And perhaps they took that for granted, and they've become somewhat known as the beleaguered party. But back to Stephane Dion, when you look at what he's done recently, his declaration of a whipped vote with this whole expansion of the Terrorist Act, I mean, that has gotten him embroiled within his own party. And then you're looking at this affirmative action where he's saying that he's going to ban male candidates in certain ridings. Right. These are issues that have really created, I think, some bad press for Stephane Dion, not only in the eyes of the public, but even, well, as you know, among his own party members.
Well, I think that part of the problem is that we're used to thinking of Liberals as being this homogenous group of people who all think the same way. I think what we're seeing, both at the leadership election and now with the various dictates causing all of these schisms and fractures, is that the Liberal Party is federally quite a group of groups. and that they have, there's a left-wing faction and a sort of...
Oh, lots of dissension in the ranks right now.
And you start laying down the lines like nobody has ever laid them down before within the organization, and you suddenly are going to expose all of the cracks. I think that, you know, he's got a few more chances to heal the wounds, and after that, he's pretty much put that party behind by about 3 to 5 years.
You've got it. Okay, yes.
Well, I was going to say, I think if you look at their decade and a few years in power, most recently, the one thing that I think united the Liberals was they all wanted to be in government. And beyond that, you had different policies, different politics. Some people had no politics at all, but just simply wanted to sit in the government benches. And that's fine as long as you're winning elections, but when you stop winning elections, it's not much of a basis to build a coherent party, to build a coherent vision, to put forward a set of policies. Now, I personally think that some of the things that Dion's done has been good, and I think they're consistent with a small L Liberal vision of Canada, and to the extent that the large L Liberal Party is also a small L Liberal Party, he should be doing that. But what I think the most recent divisions in the party expose is exactly the issue you brought out, which is that it's a large L Liberal Party, but they don't necessarily have a coherent or consistent philosophy that's uniting all of their members. And so they go across the spectrum on these issues. And when you're in government, there's a certain amount of discipline you have because you reward people with various plums, you give them cabinet jobs, you give them parliamentary assistantship jobs and so on. But when you're out of government, you don't have the same carrots to kind of keep people in line, and so it's a lot harder for him to maintain discipline in the current environment.
I think that's inherent in any party that really doesn't have a guiding philosophy or moral code or anything. I mean, I am quite fortunate in Freedom Party where you know, we're the party of personal responsibility and individual freedom, and so the people who join our party know what they're getting before they join.
Yes.
And there's not this feeling that, hey, well, why don't we have a faction that does this and a faction that does the opposite, and between the two of us we'll somehow find a middle ground that stands for absolutely nothing. It just doesn't sit well with our party, and I, as a result,
yes.
I can take a stronger view.
A genuine leader will take a stand, and he's not going to please, he or she is not going to please everybody. But with Stephane Dion, what he declared, particularly with the whole affirmative action, because that's what it was, to ban male candidates, I mean, that came across as nothing more than a desperate action to try to win female support, which have been, and women by and large have been large supporters of the Liberal Party. And to me, the whole action was desperate, to the point where they may have lost, it may have backfired from that point of view.
And the goal is worthy. I mean, in Canada, when you look around the world, we're trailing a lot of countries in terms of the number of women who are actually sitting in Parliament. So the goal of saying that we should have a Parliament that should be as open to women as it is to men is a good goal.
It's okay to encourage it, but affirmative action where you're going to take, quote, extreme measures and ban male candidates from certain ridings, that is affirmative action, and affirmative action has always been based on systemic discrimination.
Oh yes, I agree.
In order to implement something like this. That is quite radical, wouldn't you say?
You know, there's ways to achieve the goal that are negative ways to achieve the goal, and there are ways to get there that are positive ways, and I think there are lots of ways to encourage, to support, to enable women to run in ridings and so on, all that stuff. But you're right. What Stephane Dion has done, again, in my view, is he's articulated a worthy goal, which is to increase the number of women within the Liberal Party sitting in Parliament, but then he goes about it in the wrong way.
I think the duty of a leader in any party who thinks that women are being discouraged from running is to be more sensitive to what's going on in terms of the language used, in terms of the structures used. I mean, I have attended meetings where the men, just like in a classroom of 8-year-old children, will be more boisterous and etc. And you know, there are times when either I, as the party leader, or someone who's you know, in charge of the meeting, will be asked, "Hold on, I want to hear what this person has to say." And I think that that's the first duty, not to count numbers, which only undermines a person's feeling of. I mean, you don't know why you're there if you were forced in because of your gender. And I don't think there's any shortage of talented women who are perfectly capable of doing that job. There is obviously in some political parties, and I hope not in mine, a failure by the leadership to make sure that women don't feel shut out in conversations. Women and men, they offer up their criticisms differently and at different times, and that needs to be accommodated.
We must go for a break now. When we come back, well, according to a Globe and Mail columnist, Canadians are starting to warm up to the idea of private health care, or are we? Stay tuned. Hello again and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Well, according to a Globe and Mail columnist, Canadians are warming up to the idea of private health care delivery. Now, our question here is, are Canadians really warming up to that? Or is that just sort of a phrase or a sentence that's purported by the columnist in hopes that people start warming up to it? I mean, this is a debate. And according to this article here, he's basically saying that the professionals are warming up to it in a sense. I mean, I guess that's what he means. And he's saying that Canadians are following suit, but I'm not so sure. I mean, I'm hearing arguments still going pretty heavy on both sides. Quebec has been seen as a model of this, where when you look at the greatest concern among Canadians are wait times, and the possibility of starting to bill for service is being looked at as a possibility. But I want to start with you this time, Michael. Do you really think Canadians are warming up to that idea, or do you think there's still a little bit of doubt of exposing us to a two-tier system?
I'm a bit dubious about cherry-picking various polls. I haven't seen the underlying polls that Jeffrey Simpson has based his opinions on, so I'm a bit dubious about this. And of course, a lot of polling depends on how you phrase the question, who you ask.
Precisely.
You get the results. He's been on. He's a very smart guy, I have to say, Jeffrey Simpson, and he's been on this hobby horse for quite some time. What he's saying is that the cost of healthcare in Canada is increasing.
It certainly is.
It's increasing dramatically, and something has to be done about that. And he's absolutely right about that. No one right across the spectrum disagrees with that notion. But the fundamental question that has to be asked is, if we go to a system that relies more on private healthcare, is that going to bring the cost down, or is that just simply going to shuffle the costs off in some other way and end up with a system like we see in the United States, where you have people, some people who are covered because they're very poor, some people who are covered.
It's a for-profit healthcare system,
it
which
is.
I don't think Canadians really want to see.
And it's not any less expensive than our system, but there are a lot of people who are excluded because they don't have the public administration of one level of the system. So, I think there are smart people like Roy Romano, who spent a lot of his time lately looking into the cracks and crevices, talking to the people that know about healthcare reform. He set out a pretty good prescription. I think the original vision of healthcare, if you go back to Tommy Douglas in Saskatchewan, is one that resonates with Canadians, and that is, people say that if you get sick, it shouldn't depend on your income as to getting access to the kind of care you need to get.
Universal health care, that's what we're based on.
I think everybody supports that.
That's true.
Well, I don't, but...
you don't support universal health care.
I don't support tax-funded health care, but that's because I don't think it works for anybody. And I don't think it's moral. But let me explain one other thing, and that is that we're hearing about Canadians and whether they are opening up to, or whether they're warming up to private delivery. Well, the fact is, private delivery is not an issue. A lot of the hospitals that people are using today, around for decades, are currently privately owned. The issue is that they're publicly funded. They're funded with taxpayer dollars. This is a false issue, this idea about paying more private hospitals. That's not really an issue. It won't change the fact that we're still in a universal funding system, and that's what makes it public. The fact that some private, a doctor's office is a private business, there's thousands of these, it's never been the case that there weren't public-private partnerships and private delivery of healthcare. Most healthcare has always been privately delivered. The issue is, and it's reflected not so loudly in the results of this poll, they don't highlight it, that Canadians are warming up to the idea that instead of paying taxes and using those taxes to pay for a government-run health insurance system, that they should be able to use their own money to buy private insurance. And the results also show in their studies that the greater number of those polled are in favor of allowing people to buy their own, have their choice about what health insurance they want. And when that happens, then health insurers, when they have to compete, will have to compete to earn the money that's paid by the patient. They'll have to please the patient, not the politician. And that's key if we're to have a system that's not only cheaper but better.
Yes. Now, one thing that Jeffrey Simpson highlights here is that Canadians, by and large, want to see a better system, an effective system where the wait times are less. But something else when it comes to the Romano report that, unfortunately, he's saying here that most Canadians aren't even aware of what's really going on, of the moves that have been made of late by the government to try to deal with this mess of a taxed and overtaxed medical system. We want to see it more effectively run, but Canadians generally don't want to pay more taxes. So to say that they're warming up to private healthcare delivery, I'm not even sure what that means anymore. I'm talking about the context that Jeffrey Simpson is talking about here, because it would follow that if most Canadians are not aware of what exactly is going on within the system, how could you make that leap and say that most are in favor of something? Unless perhaps they're just following reports that they see and they figure, well, that sounds pretty good, and according to that stat, maybe I should follow suit. I don't think people are by and large aware of what, according to his polling here, or what he says, they're not aware of what's going on.
That's true.
This is what he's saying. I'm not saying I agree with what he's saying, but
I think it is true. I don't think people, it's a very complex area. I don't think they realize that most delivery is already private. But I think that the reason we're seeing the debates we're seeing about delivery, everyone's focusing on delivery, but the people focusing on delivery are people who don't want the issue of funding to be brought into the public debate. And so we see even conservatives who are afraid that this would mean smaller government. They'd have to deal with union concerns. They'd have to deal with downsizing of the government, possibly some short-term unemployment as government workers had to find jobs in the private sector. They think it's political dynamite, so they will not bring up the topic, the real issue, which is who pays. Do you pay the doctor directly as a patient? Do you pay your insurer directly as a patient? Or do you hand over your money to the government and hope that they give you what they think you need?
Paul, what are you in favor of? Yes, go
Well,
ahead.
I was going to say, if you start to raise that question, then you immediately have to say, what about people who can't pay? And that was
And
the
that is
problem
a crucial
before the
question.
1960s when we didn't have this single-payer system that we have in Canada. That was the fundamental question. If you were poor, you got sick and you died. If you had some money, you got health care. And Canadians said, we don't like that kind of system. We want to have access. Now, it's a tremendously complex system now, but within this single-payer system, there are efficiencies in the system. We look at Alberta and look at how Alberta, for hip replacement, was able to streamline, save huge amounts of public dollars by bringing in some efficiencies into the system. There are all sorts of efficiencies.
That's
I think
a big way. We need to look at the efficiencies of the system. That's been shown over and over again. But Paul, you do agree with the universal healthcare system?
No, I don't. I think that it's wrong, that it disconnects the interests of the patient.
Okay, what happens to the poor? Now, I know that we're running out of time. That's why I'm pressing you quickly on this.
Yeah. The poor have to pay for health care like they would pay for auto insurance. They would pay for health insurance the same way. And we did have, prior to 1968, actually, people did not want this system. Doctors threatened to go on strike. People didn't want to have to pay a brand new income tax. The Progressive Conservatives had to bring in the provincial income tax just to force everyone to buy public government-run health insurance. So this was not something they wanted to do. It's something that we've rewritten 2020 hindsight with, well, actually blind in one eye. It's not the case we wanted this. It's the case that we're stuck with it. And I think that we have to re-examine that and bring it back. The poor should
You're a poverty advocate here.
The defining feature, I think,
Yes.
if you ask most Canadians, what is the thing that makes us most proud as Canadians, is that we don't allow people who are sick to die because they can't afford
Yes,
health
I
care.
That's an
agree with
issue
you,
of welfare.
yes.
You don't have
I agree
to.
with you.
You don't have to transfer wealth by making all people buy publicly supplied insurance. You can provide money if that's what's desirable. You can provide money in the form of cash so that the poor and the rich alike will still have the choices among which insurers they're going to buy. There's nothing in that. There's nothing inconsistent between helping the needs of the poor and having choice for the poor and the rich alike. They're two separate
The
issues.
system you're describing is the system in the United States, which is more costly. However you measure cost, they pay more money for health care.
And lots of suits as well. It becomes very market.
And lots of people who
Open to the market.
are in the gap between being so poor they get government help and so rich they can afford their own assistance.
It's expensive in the States because the United States governments require their plans to cover a host of things so that they can get votes and money from chiropractors and physiotherapists, et cetera. And if people just had the freedom to buy the insurance they want and need, there would be no problem for the poor.
Oh, Paul and Michael, big difference here, and we're out of time.
There is.
Thank you both so much for joining me for Viewpoints.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go for a break now. When we come back, we'll be looking at tips for the winter blues. Stay tuned.